By 458 BC, Rome was still a small, compact, and vulnerable city, surrounded by hills, fields, and nearby enemies. The Republic did not govern an immense or peaceful territory, but rather a strip of unstable power in the center of Italy, where each military campaign could determine the survival of the community. The walls, narrow streets, and austere houses spoke of a city in formation, proud yet still fragile, forced to live with an almost permanent tension between external war and internal conflict. In that world, war was not the concern of a professional elite separate from the population. The free men of Rome were also farmers, and many had to leave their fields when the military call came. This reality deeply marked daily life. A small landowner could leave his plot unattended in the midst of planting or harvesting to wield a spear in defense of the city. The rural economy depended on hard manual labor, modest plots, and family strength. Thus, each military conscription disrupted not only the battlefield but also the sustenance of households. The line between soldier and farmer was very thin. At the same time, Roman society was marked by political and social inequality that did not disappear simply because they fought under the same banner. The patricians monopolized the magistracies, religious auspices, and much of the traditional prestige, while the plebeians bore debts, insecurity, and the constant threat of losing their land. For many ordinary citizens, war did not only bring glory, it also meant more taxes, more absence, and more dependence. The tensions over access to land and the burden of military obligations fueled a discontent that was not accidental but structural. To this internal pressure was added the external threat. The Equians, a neighboring Italic people, took advantage of Roman weakness to harass the territory and draw the armies into a war of attrition. Mount Algidus, rough and strategic, became a decisive point on that unstable frontier. There, in difficult and mountainous terrain, the Romans could find themselves surrounded, isolated, and subjected to exhaustion. Defeat was not an abstract possibility. It meant the direct exposure of the city, the loss of military prestige, and the risk that the young republic would appear incapable of protecting its own citizens. Thus, in exceptional moments, Rome resorted to an exceptional solution: dictatorship. It was not yet conceived as an arbitrary power in the modern sense, but as an emergency magistracy intended to resolve a specific crisis quickly and obediently. Roman tradition turned this resource into a test of political maturity. When ordinary institutions were insufficient, authority was concentrated in a single hand, but only for a limited time and with a clear objective. This institutional fragility, combined with military necessity and social division, explains the climate in which the figure of Cincinnatus emerged. An aristocrat who worked the land, but also a citizen called to prioritize the common good over any private interest. The Senate's emissaries advanced from the city along dirt paths until they reached a small estate on the outskirts, where political urgency stood in stark contrast to the routine of the countryside. There they found Lucius Quinctius Cincinnatus engaged in the oldest and most Roman of tasks, guiding the plow, with the oxen furrowing straight rows in a humble plot that demanded patience, strength, and discipline. Tradition emphasized this detail because it encapsulated a fundamental idea of the early republic. Legitimate power should not be separated from duty, nor prestige from service, nor civic greatness from a simple life. The scene carried enormous symbolic weight. Cincinnatus was not surrounded by guards seated in a luxurious atrium, nor awaiting honors. He was dressed as a farmer, embodying the simplicity of one who works the land and knows firsthand the harshness of sustenance. His hands, marked by toil, served as a reminder that a good portion of the Roman elite remained connected, at least in ideal memory, to agriculture and modest property. In a society that distrusted excessive luxury, the countryside was more than an economic space. It was a moral model, the image of an ancient virtue that the city sought to preserve. When the messengers arrived, they did not bring an ordinary request. They came to announce that Rome needed a dictator, an exceptional authority for a military emergency that had surpassed the usual commanders. The city was alarmed by the siege on Mount Algidus and by the pressure from the Equians. The Senate, unable to resolve the crisis with normal resources, turned to a man whose reputation for integrity made him worthy of extraordinary obedience. History preserves the moment as a solemn interruption of daily life. The furrow opened in the earth, and suddenly, the call of the Republic. According to tradition, Cincinnatus received the message without theatrical hesitation. He stopped his work, left the plow, and accepted that public urgency imposed his duty over any private obligation. Before departing, he requested to don the toga, the garment that in Rome transformed the common citizen into a bearer of authority and political representation. That gesture held almost ceremonial value, from the clay of the field to the order of the city, from agricultural labor to military command, from domestic modesty to public responsibility. It was not a personal elevation, but a temporary burden imposed by necessity. The strength of the episode lies in that dual truth. On one hand, it reflects the real fragility of Rome, capable of seeking a single man to save it. On the other, it projects an ideal highly cherished by later Romans. The perfect leader is not one who pursues power, but one who accepts it gravely and relinquishes it without resistance when the crisis is over. The messenger found the farmer, but the Republic found in him something more valuable than a commander. It found the image of a citizen whose authority arose precisely from never having abandoned the land, the work, and the measure. The Roman dictatorship concentrated authority in a single man, an authority that, in normal times, was distributed among magistrates and the Senate. However, this concentration did not signify disorder or personal ambition. In the Republican memory, its justification was efficiency. Cincinnatus took command and acted as if every hour mattered, because it indeed did. The city could not afford an extension of the crisis, and the army trapped on Mount Algidus needed assistance before the enemy encirclement broke Roman resistance. From Rome, the mobilization was swift and severe. Citizens capable of bearing arms were summoned, regardless of their private comforts, for at that time, war still depended on the conscription of landowners and peasants. The dictator imposed discipline with the urgency of one who knows that improvisation in the field equates to disaster. The Roman camp, established with its austere order of tents, stakes, and fires, became the center of a compact military response. The strategy was not to seek spectacular glory, but to break the siege and restore the initiative. Mount Algidus dominated the landscape as a rough and cold obstacle, ideal for a war of positions. There, Lucius Minucius's army was immobilized, harassed by the Equi and separated from the city by difficult terrain. The situation was not only military, it was also moral. A besieged consul represented the failure of ordinary command, and a Roman troop trapped with no escape could become a symbol of humiliation before the Italic enemies. Cincinnatus understood that he had to act not with prolonged caution, but with total speed. Tradition holds that he advanced without delay, organized the soldiers into formation, and reached the siege area with a determination that surprised the Equi. Instead of launching a disordered frontal attack, he ordered the encirclement of the enemy camp and the construction of a line of fortification. The scene reveals much about ancient warfare. Before the great siege engines, elementary engineering, trenches, palisades, constant vigilance could decide a campaign. The Romans did not only fight with spear and shield, they also triumphed by digging, closing passages, and controlling the terrain. As the siege was reversed, the Equi found themselves trapped in the same logic they had imposed on the Romans. The Equi camp, more irregular and precarious, did not withstand that pressure well. Hunger, exhaustion, and Roman discipline ultimately broke their position. Lucius Minucius and his men were freed from immediate danger, and the balance of the campaign tilted in favor of Rome. It was not a broad victory or a definitive conquest, but a decisive triumph in political terms. It demonstrated that exceptional command, when exercised with resolution and limits, could save the community. In the Roman narrative, that moment transformed Cincinnatus into something more than a victorious general. It turned him into the living proof that authority could be absolute without ceasing to be temporary, and that republican discipline had more strength than personal ambition. The march to Mount Algidus was not merely a military operation. It was the confirmation of a civic ideal that Rome would transmit for centuries as a model of speed, obedience, and service. The victory on Mount Algidus did not usher in a phase of ambition, but rather the exact moment when the emergency began to fade. In the logic of the Roman Republic, that was the true test of power. Not only knowing how to seize it to save the community, but also knowing how to relinquish it when it was no longer necessary. Cincinnatus had been called for a military crisis, and once the situation was restored, he did not turn the dictatorship into a personal instrument. The extraordinary authority, which in other cities might have slipped into tyranny, remained in Rome tied to a principle of limitation. According to tradition, 16 days after being appointed, he resigned from office. The number became famous because it encapsulated the idea of brevity and restraint, an absolute command exercised only for the necessary time. The Senate, the institution that had sought a solution in him, thus reaffirmed its own political logic. The Republic could accept an exceptional concentration of power, but only under one condition: that the beneficiary did not confuse service with possession. The swiftness of victory was matched by the swiftness of resignation. Cincinnatus's return to his small estate had enormous symbolic weight. The man who had commanded armies and decided the fate of Rome returned to the plow, to the land worked with his own hands, to the modest world of citizens who live by their labor. It was not simply a private withdrawal, but a public gesture laden with meaning. Power should not distance the good Roman from simplicity or from the agricultural duty that sustained the life of the city. In the Republican imagination, the ideal citizen was precisely that: someone capable of leaving his field to save the community and returning to it without claiming a reward. Over time, this episode became more than a military memory. It transformed into a political lesson about moderation, obedience to the law, and the rejection of perpetual power. The figure of Cincinnatus offered Rome a response to its own fears. Dictatorship could exist, but only as a temporary remedy. Authority could be strong, but it must not harden into domination. That is why tradition elevated him as an example of civic virtue, although ancient sources also show how these accounts were shaped and embellished to serve as moral models. The historical importance of that memory lies not only in what might have occurred, but in what Rome wanted to remember about itself. In a world marked by border wars, social inequality, and institutional fragility, the citizen farmer became an image of political order. The land as origin, the city as duty, and power as a temporary burden. The small estate and the plow became forever associated with a decisive idea of Roman culture. Those who govern well are not those who cling to power, but those who know how to abandon it when the Republic has been saved.